Kevin Ladd, and it's my pleasure to be a part of this study in Brazil on the cognitive psychology of religion. Today I would like to give a bit of an introduction on the topic of open science and how it is that open science and its principles can serve to guide what is happening in this particular series of projects that we are looking to fund across the country of Brazil. In this particular set of projects, one of the first things that we will notice is a variety of challenges. Some of these challenges include the notion of credibility. This is really one of the very first principles that open science tries to address. Because credibility, or the manner in which the studies have been conducted, is of the utmost importance. Part of what we see with the open science movement is a reaction to studies that have included fraudulent data or exceptionally poor methodologies in other fashions. The open science movement also seeks to address issues of clarity. Clarity becomes obviously important because it is through clarity that we are able to best express the ideas with precision. Relevance is also of critical importance to the open science movement because we want to be able to take science out of the laboratory and place it squarely into the areas where it can do the most good. Being able to do the most good also entails being able to do something more than once. And so reproducibility is incredibly important because without the ability to reproduce findings, we remain uncertain of exactly what it is that we know. Some of these things are specific responses to questionable research practices that we have seen grow up across the years, not just in psychology, but across science more broadly. People have engaged in very selective reporting of their findings. They might conduct studies that have several hundred different possible correlations and then only choose to present one or two. In doing so, this skews our findings in a most unhelpful way by capitalizing on chance. It is also the case that we have in some situations seen individuals manipulating the size of their samples not in order to answer particular questions, but to overpower studies. For it is possible to collect too much data and then the results begin to look significant even when they are not necessarily of importance to us. Something known as harking has also come onto the scene. This particular acronym stands for hypothesizing after the results are known. When we engage in this process, we collect the data, we analyze it, and then we reason backwards to what might have been a rational understanding of an outcome, but we do it after the fact. This sort of post hoc reasoning is obviously not a part of a good scientific method, but it becomes very tempting when the emphasis falls on outcomes instead of methods. And so one of the things that open science has very strongly promulgated is the idea that it is the method that is the most important, and the outcomes stand on their own merits. You will see here in the upper left corner that I've placed a website where you can go and investigate some of these statements about the open science movement. It is also on this site that they have created the ability for researchers to both store and share freely all of the data that they are in the process of working with. In this way, one of the things that we note is that people are able to very freely access the data. And when the data are openly shared, it helps to keep all researchers equally accountable to the same good research principles that we want to encourage. The sharing of the data also rapidly encourages people to engage in the process of reanalyzing, of asking the same kinds of questions that the original researchers did, but it provides the ability to immediately verify that the procedures are what they said they were. In other words, part of the open science movement is helping to keep honest researchers honest. Another great benefit of the open science format is the ability that it provides for researchers on a global level to engage in real-time research. So as the project unfolds, as there are conversations taking place between research collaboration partners, in all of these situations, it is possible on the open science platform to record and deliver these conversations. Now, these conversations can be kept private just among team members, or they can be made more broadly available. Early in the stages of research, most groups tend to keep these private, but it's not necessary to do so. The standards that we investigate here with regard to the Open Science Project include such things as clear and transparent citations of the data. Once your data are available on an open science platform, and you have chosen to make those data public, other people can access the data set you have collected and begin to investigate other hypotheses that are relevant to the questions that you asked. By doing so, people in disparate parts of the globe are able to share data collected in one place for analysis in another. When this happens, your data that might otherwise have been locked into your own relatively circumscribed sphere of influence now takes on a broad global basis, and the other researchers cite it as such, pointing for additional collaborators to find their way back to you and your research team. The methodology is something that is also critical to publish with regard to open science protocols. For by publishing the methods that we use, what we are doing as researchers is holding ourselves accountable to a strict and systematic adherence to good science principles. By utilizing a consistent and examinable form of methodology, we once again enhance the nature of the research and place the emphasis squarely where it needs to be on the conduct of good and clear scientific method, with less emphasis and less results on what the outcomes may show. By adding to the method the specific design and the analysis that we intend to follow, we lay out a very clear trajectory for our research. This very specifically helps to eliminate that process of harking, so that we are no longer possibly able to hypothesize after the results are known, because we have already, in a public forum, identified precisely the questions and the ways in which we will analyze those questions. As part of this process, then, when we have our methods, our design, and our analyses all on the table, we are therefore then very free and at ease to disclose the actual data that we have used. Many of us have had the very frustrating experience of trying to verify or further investigate particular data sets and found that the data sets have been walled off from us by many different means, and it becomes very, very difficult to verify or to expand on research that has been done by other investigators. One of the critical standards in the open science movement, then, is this ability and this opportunity, this dedication on the part of researchers to actually share their data not 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road after it is dug out of some hidden archive, but up front as an initial part of the research program. Now again, these data disclosure do not have to be done immediately, but they should be logged and registered, because even if they are kept private from the public view at this particular moment, they receive a time and a date stamp, which locks them in as having been completed, having been recorded, having been filed at a particular moment in time. This then gives other researchers the assurance of knowing that the data are what they are at that moment in time. In addition to disclosing the data, likewise, many of us have had the very frustrating experience of trying to find materials that were used, trying to find copies of the exact questionnaires or the instructions given to participants as part of some sort of a project, and finding again ourselves stonewalled at many different turns. By utilizing the standards and adhering to the standards of the open science framework, we agree to publish the materials in this same repository. And so as we are developing our materials, we can keep an ongoing record for internal use of our research collaboration teams, which can then be rolled over into a public access once the materials are in their final stages that we will actually be utilizing. An additional component here then that goes along with this is this entire process known as pre-registration. Pre-registration allows us to generate exactly the sort of materials that we have just been talking about, to level the playing field in terms of making access to our methods, our design, our analysis, our data, and our materials available to others. By pre-registering exactly how we are going to conduct the study, we once again commit ourselves to following the highest possible standards of the scientific method. All of these things work together then to enable other researchers to come along behind us and to use our particular sorts of designs and materials in other settings. As we have discovered repeatedly across the years, and as continues to be made even more evident in contemporary research, this process of replication is very, very critical. And it is critical not only in the context in which we find ourselves initially, but it is even more critical, perhaps, to begin to engage in replications on a global scale, such that what we are doing is not simply exporting ideas from one place to another, but rather exploring the extent to which ideas from one place actually fit with conceptions in other places around the globe. And so these replications become of critical importance, and our ability to engage in them is greatly facilitated when we adhere to these principles of open science. Part of the recognition of the scholarly community, then, is that for individuals and research teams who adhere to these principles of open science, certain journals have agreed to designate these publications when they come out as having upheld these particular sorts of standards. And so in some instances, journals will award your article a special designation, very clearly marked in the publication format, to show that the researchers have chosen to willingly share their data in a public forum. It is also possible to receive a second kind of a very explicit badging or a notification that accompanies the publication of your article that very explicitly identifies you and your research team as having been willing to share not just the data, but also all materials that were involved in the process of collecting those data. A third kind of a badge that it is possible to receive, and again, these are physically placed on the published article such that readers are immediately able to identify the levels of adherence to open science principles, is the badge known as pre-registration. When you have stated very clearly precisely the analysis package that you will be using, the strategy for analysis, and the hypotheses that you are testing, you have moved yourself to a different level of scrutiny and a different level of transparency. To say just a few more words about this notion of pre-registration, some of the things that come along with this are ideas about confirmation. In this notion of confirmation, we see that some other studies are also going to be exploratory. When this happens, what we have are two separate sections of the pre-registration. In the first instance of confirmatory pre-registration, what we are saying is here are our hypotheses and here is how we will test them. This locks us into a particular kind of investigation to which we have committed ourselves. This does not, however, stop us from engaging in the second kind of investigation, or an exploratory investigation. This exploratory investigation is not necessarily part of the formal pre-registration process. The formal pre-registration process is where we state our particular hypotheses and how we will test them. We all know, however, from various research endeavors in the past, that when we begin to look at our data, we are sometimes surprised by what it is that we see. What happens in this instance is that after we have finished our confirmatory analyses with the pre-registration, we next are able then to begin investigating exploratory hypotheses. These are hypotheses that are generated once we have actually seen the data, and so they are more potentially susceptible to bias. Part of what this pre-registration project does is it ensures that we first lock in the theoretically sound confirmatory hypotheses, and then we are able to very clearly state, once we have completed those, that now we are moving to a different phase of our research. We are moving to an exploratory phase. What this has the effect of doing is alerting our readers that we have finished the most theoretically rigorous portion of our studies, and now we are venturing out into new territory. This particular way of staging our presentation becomes very important because it speaks directly to the standard of open science known as clarity. We are very clearly, when we adopt this procedure, letting our readers know how our research project unfolded. We are not trying to sort of sneak exploratory hypotheses in as though we already knew what we were planning to do. Instead, we are very open and transparent about the fact that this particular set of hypotheses arose only after viewing the data, and therefore we and our readers alike should judge these outcomes and these questions with a higher level of skepticism. In all of these situations, part of what we are using these exploratory notions for certainly have to do with idea verification, to see if future notions of investigation might be worthwhile. They speak directly to clarity of our data and our methods because we are not hiding the process behind any sort of veneer or curtain that might be drawn otherwise. And what these all do is they work together to give our study a greater level of credibility because we have engaged in a much more transparent process. I would like also to turn our attention just briefly here to the ideas of registered reporting. These registered reports are a relatively new addition to the field, and I place here in the upper left a link that you can go to and spend more time investigating how it is that these registered reports are developed and shared with the research community. As I mentioned earlier, one of the first projects that is critical within a registered report is to clearly specify the design. How is it that you will obtain the sample of individuals or other participants in your study? Where will they come from? How will they be distributed? What kinds of manipulations or questionnaires or interviews might you include in your study? Once this is set and it is registered on your open science platform, your design is something that you can continue to modify and change, but at any moment in time, it has been registered as your idea. By registering it as your idea, what open science means is that it is again time-stamped and date-stamped, so that everyone knows that, for instance, on the 8th of September in 2020, you had a particular idea that you were choosing to investigate with a particular approach. This helps to protect your ideas. Again, when you have registered your ideas in this open science framework, it does not mean that it has to be shared publicly immediately, but it can be shared later, retaining that original timestamp and date stamp to help alleviate concerns or questions about who did what when. This also, by registering these different kinds of ideas, allows us, if we so desire, to solicit feedback not only from our research collaborators, but in a wider public forum. We may or may not choose to do this at different stages, and we can move our registration back and forth from public to private domains depending upon how it is that our project unfolds. These lead, of course, to different kinds of revisions, and all of these revisions also can be saved online in this repository, such that all of your collaborators, and if you choose, other people in the public domain, are able to explore these revisions and make creative suggestions. All of these different things speak to utilizing the power of the internet and this particular kind of an online source as a way to radically increase the democracy associated with the process of research. It becomes a distributed kind of network, should we wish to take that route, which gives us access to researchers whom we may never have met. In this way, registering reports online opens up a very literal global community to help structure and improve our projects. Once these registered reports have met all of these different criteria, then we begin to work explicitly on these processes with the editors of different journals. There are a select few journals, and if you go to the link in the upper left corner, you will see that there is a tab toward the middle section, toward the upper middle section of the screen, that allows you to see what journals will work with you on a fully registered report. For instance, the Archive for the Psychology of Religion is among the most applicable here that will work directly with you. There are other psychology of religion journals that are also mentioned. But if you find one of these, what you do is not only to register your materials in the OSF online, you also begin to speak directly with the editorial team at the different journals. As they look over your work, if they decide to accept it for review, the process of review and revision will go from something that you are doing more or less on your own to something that the journal will begin to help in the process of. Your work at that point, that has been duly registered, time-stamped, and date-stamped on the Open Science or other similar repository, will be sent out for external reviews. Those reviews will come back, and they will be talking primarily to you about the logic of your study. In other words, the role of the journal shifts from only evaluating your completed article to evaluating your article before you have collected any data whatsoever. In other words, the emphasis of the journal shifts from being sort of a judge at the end of the entire process to a partner at the very beginning of the process. This is an incredible revolution in the publishing process, because rather than coming to the very end of a research project and being told by reviewers that there is no way to salvage or to repair your project and it must be discarded, the registered report process begins the evaluation before you collect data, and it helps you to better refine your method and your data collection process, the nature of the questions, the hypotheses that are being addressed. It addresses all of these theoretical and mechanical issues before you begin collecting data. If you and the reviewers ultimately are able to arrive at a consensus on what would be a good scientifically sound methodology with good scientifically sound principles of data collection and analysis, at that point the journal editor is free to offer what is referred to as an in-principle acceptance. What this does is it tells you that the journal editors and the reviewers agree with you that if you follow the procedure that you have together identified as being acceptable, if you follow that procedure, your article will be accepted for publication, pending final review, of course, but your article will be accepted for final publication regardless of the outcome of the data. In other words, it takes away the pressure to try to look specifically for statistically significant findings, and instead says what we care most about is that you are doing good science. If you are doing good science, we will publish your findings, even if the results happen to be non-significant. With this idea in mind, then, of the in-principle acceptance, what happens next is that after you and the editorial team have agreed to that principle, then you begin your data collection. Following the data collection, you do a standard write-up that includes demonstrating how you followed the principles you agreed to follow, how you collected your data, how you did the analysis in accord with the principles you agreed to follow. And once you have finished that write-up, you submit it to the journal editors. The reviewers check your work for consistency against what it was that you promised to do, and then, as long as the consistency check proves to be satisfactory, the article moves into publication. In other words, what this does is it sets up a revolutionary new process, so that instead of spending all of the time, the effort, and the money to engage in a data collection of a study that later proves to be not worthy by reviewers, here it is that first the editorial team works with you to make the best possible study something that will be acceptable to their journal in the first instance. And then you go out with the assurance of that in-principle acceptance of your article. You collect the data, you write it up, and it moves back toward the publication process with no further questions about the methodology or the theoretical components, because those have already been agreed to. It really does revolutionize how it is that we think about what we value the most in our publications, and squarely places the emphasis on the scientific methodology, the integrity of that methodology, and the transparency of that methodology, and then allows the outcomes, the results, to fall where they may. When we are thinking then about how it is to find articles that are going to be particularly interesting in these veins, this particular project that we are looking at now, the cognitive science of religion in Brazil, would benefit greatly from authors taking this approach of registered reports. This will be stressed very much as we review the proposals for grant funding, and those who come to us with these registered reports in line will be given top priority. In addition, what we will be looking for are strong emphases on theoretical notions. Purely exploratory kinds of studies are not going to be regarded as strongly as those that are driven by an underlying theoretical framework. This is because the purely exploratory work does not necessarily give us as many specific ways to see the potential benefits of how the current research dovetails with or fits into, aligns with previous work in the field. And finding those points of contacts between specific theories, whether those theories are of a global nature or whether they are theories that are specifically developed by researchers in Brazil, in either case, the theoretical mooring and foundations of the work are going to be incredibly important because they help us to more systematically expand the field. It is also the case that we are looking for specific kinds of research within the proposals. We are looking for research that has depth to it. We are not looking for quick, superficial projects. Instead, we are looking for things that investigate questions on multiple levels. Here it is that scales have some merit for us, but they are certainly not the only way to gain this sort of depth. And with regard to scales, it is also the case that we will look very closely at the extent to which scales are things that make sense, are conceptually making sense, particularly within the Brazilian context. What we are not as excited about are scales that are simply being exported from some other area of the world and dropped into the Brazilian context. While that particular approach to research has merit because it lets us know how people in Brazil think like people in other parts of the world, part of what we really want to develop in this particular series of projects is a sensibility for what it is that is unique or distinctive about the Brazilian context. We really want to encourage, therefore, the use of scales that are very closely and clearly understood to be relevant specifically to a Brazilian context. We are also looking for ways that we understand that the work is going to lead to educational value. In this sense, what we are talking about are studies that raise additional kinds of questions that can be utilized, especially in the research labs, in the teaching of courses across the country of Brazil, such that we are able to magnify the influence of this project, not just on paper with publications, but also on syllabi, on course structures, such that students begin to experience what it is that their professors are doing within the cognitive science of religion, and thereby we are able to quickly magnify to increase the scale of influence of the work here. Specifically, we are looking here to be able to help people understand different kinds of methodologies earlier in their career, such in particular that are related to the scientific study of the cognitions associated with religion, and certainly how it is that these pertain to the classroom. Along this line, some of the principles that we look at very closely here, certainly as we evaluate these, as you will have gathered at this point from the opening portions of this lecture, the notion of open science is something that is very, very critical for us to consider with regard to the projects that are being proposed. We will also look closely at the reporting standards that the potential awardees of these grants actually are using. How is it that you will identify for us where it is that you will report and talk about the processes that are underlying your proposal in a very transparent fashion? Now, these reporting standards will also extend to the different kinds of research that you are doing. For the different reporting standards, while they have some basic similarities in terms of transparency, the reporting standards, what needs to be included in qualitative and quantitative studies for publication, have some distinctive differences. Those differences are not just within psychology, but those differences also extend to interdisciplinary sorts of collaborations. So when you are engaging in transparent work within psychology, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, and for this particular study we would look very favorably on research proposals that include both qualitative and quantitative sorts of approaches, especially things that have experimental work that help to move us from interviews and understanding descriptions of things to trying to get at causality. We would also look very favorably upon research projects that involve this level of interdisciplinarity, places where psychologists are working with other scholars. Because as we all know, each one of us brings to any given project a certain set of interdisciplinary blinders or blind spots, places where we do not see or conceptualize things as well as others might who have different perspectives, different forms of background and training. And so to bring some interdisciplinary voices into a project is something that we will value very highly. In fact, if proposals come into us, some of the things that you might see coming back as feedback on the proposals might include things such as asking you to be more clear about how the qualitative and quantitative pieces work together to both describe and to move us toward understandings of causality. They might include suggestions of adding experts in other fields to the research team. These are all ways in which we will look at different proposals that are coming into us and try to help people formulate their best possible idea. And in doing so, we keep this overarching notion that one of the things that we really want to try to advocate for within this project is breaking down of some of what is known as the weirdness of psychology, to try to move some of the mindsets and our understandings of the cognitive science of religion outside of just a Western and educated and industrialized sort of a framework, such that we are able to move into other places that are not necessarily as rich as the West, and places that also are not necessarily more or less exclusively oriented toward democratic structures. In this way, we can help to advance the cognitive science of religion, and in psychology in particular, in ways that have global significance and not just individual significance in particular cultures. In the upper left corner, I offer this, and I realize that the font is very, very small here, which is why the link is provided in the upper left. If you venture off to that link, what you will find are examples of how to engage, particularly in the reporting standards that are going to be very, very critical for assembling what we will regard as a high-quality article and a proposal to accompany it in the first instance. What you see here is an example of a flowchart that very clearly identifies what is happening with a particular kind of a quantitative study. And you will see here that what this flowchart does is identify step by step the processes that are going to be most important to lay a particular kind of standard for the field. Because we know in the past one problem with psychology of religion articles is that the way in which they have chosen to articulate themselves does not automatically lend itself to being easily read by scholars more accustomed to reading mainstream articles not dealing with topics such as the psychology of religion. By moving our field of the psychology of religion into a closer adherence and alignment with these kinds of standards for preparing both quantitative and qualitative articles, we immediately move our research into a position where it has the opportunity to influence the thinking and the conceptualization of human psychology to a much greater scale. Here is another example, and again, the same link that was on the previous page will take you to this. It gives you a range of different options to look at. This is just a second example, and this provides a flowchart for a quantitative table that continues on a page-by-page sort of basis, another way of showing the same kind of information. I present these two examples, and again, I know the font is very small and virtually impossible to read, but do take some time, visit the link, and you can pull all of these materials down in a PDF format, which makes things very, very clear. I personally have also found that not only are these useful in the writing of my own work, but they are incredibly helpful from a pedagogical perspective because I can walk my students in various classes directly through this, and it makes the process so very, very easy to grasp. This becomes very important as we try to think about how it is to get psychology of religion journals and publications ready to interact with psychology on a larger sort of a platform. Some practicalities that go along with this that we will also watch for in proposals for funding. What is it that you plan to do in terms of cover letters? Cover letters to journals or to grant evaluators are exceptionally underutilized resources, because the cover letter is your place where you can make a first impression. It is very similar to the classic elevator speech. Can you summarize your entire project in one page? If you cannot, continue to refine it until you can, because any particular topic that is very vital and is alive in any good sense should be able to be expressed clearly and succinctly in a cover letter that lays out the case for why the reader, whether the grant evaluator, the journal editor, or a reviewer of any sort, why should that person continue to read your project proposal? The cover letter is something that becomes critically important. We will also watch very closely for your plan of dissemination. How is it that you would plan to tell people about your findings? It is the case at this particular moment in history that the influence of only classical publication routes, such as articles and books, has an audience that is being rapidly dwarfed in many senses by social media. How is it that you can conceptualize presenting your work, perhaps as a short YouTube video clip, or perhaps as a series of blog posts or Facebooks, or can you represent it with a variety of Instagram images that continue to flow across the progress of your project, such that people feel as though they are there with you as the project unfolds? We will be watching for close and careful understandings of how to get your research out of your lab and into the world. And by world, we don't just mean a global world of academics. We mean a global world in terms of all kinds of people for whom your research could be very influential, informative, and even inspirational. We will look very closely also at this process of reviewing, and we will try to give the best possible feedback that we are able to offer. We will, as I mentioned earlier, in the case of proposals that look particularly strong, we may be able to have the opportunity to work back and forth to some extent. Now, of course, we are on a pretty close, tightly structured deadline that will not permit us to give extensive feedback to every single proposal, but we will certainly do our best to have conversations with individual proposers, especially when the articles and the proposals, that come in look particularly strong and compelling. We will try in this way to offer constructive kinds of reviews in language that is easily intelligible and is, to the extent possible, as direct and open as possible. I thank you very much for being part of this particular project. I thank you immensely for taking the time to watch and to listen to this. I apologize over and over again for my lack of being able to address you in the Portuguese that is the language of your country. I feel poorly about that, but I am very, very thankful to our translator, Fatima, who is doing such a superb job of making sure that these ideas come across as cleanly as possible. Any difficulties with clarity, I am sure, lie with me and not with her. Again, I thank you very much for your interest in this particular project, and I wish you the best of luck as you develop your proposals and send them to us, and we look forward to reviewing them all, to continuing the friendships that we have already begun, and to finding new friends along the way. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all the very best of luck.